All right, we are beginning the final week of recorded classes. Next week will be simply time for you to complete your final exam and the last quiz. So let's get to it. We have finished up what we're calling the Cold War, and we've entered into what let's just call the present, uh, the era in which we now live. Now, quick reminder, this Wednesday on May 20th, quiz number 23 is due. Minimum of 100 words. It must be emailed or submitted in the packet. Open notes, open book, open video, no working together, no plagiarism. You should know this by now. Question: how did the Cold War end? And you can think of any number of approaches that you might take to answer that question. I'll leave that to you. So, the present. The end of the Cold War brought an era of optimism in the West. The thought was we've now eliminated the main threat to world peace, so certainly things are going to get better. President George Bush, who had been vice president under President Ronald Reagan, began his administration with a growing economy and a collapsing Soviet Union. The United States was the undisputed world power. There was no question as to who was in charge. Unfortunately, stability and peace was rather short-lived. In 1990, Saddam Hussein and his nation of Iraq invaded Kuwait. Kuwait is a very small but very capable oil producing nation in the Middle East near Saudi Arabia. And Kuwait was one of the, let's just call it allies of the United States, primarily because it did supply so much oil. Iraq was broke. Iraq from 1980 to 1988 had fought the tremendously expensive Iran-Iraq war, in which the two nations tried to destroy each other for various reasons. So, because Kuwait was an ally and because Kuwait was a supplier of oil, the United States intervened. So, President Bush demanded Iraq's retreat. Hussein responded with the promise of destruction for the American forces and the mother of all battles. That's the words he used. Now, at the time, this was a significant threat. The Iraqi army was probably the fifth or the sixth largest in the world. Keep in mind, when 1990 happens, the ending of the Vietnam War was only 15 years in the past. So the ideas of Vietnam were fresh in the American mind, and there had not been a military conflict since Vietnam. And so many people believe that if America went to Kuwait to liberate Kuwait and fight the Iraqis, it would be another Vietnam. The United States would lose, not only militarily, but also prestige. In 1991, however, the United States led a coalition in what was called first Operation Desert Shield, and then when it became a more, I guess, aggressive fight rather than defensive, it became Operation Desert Storm, now known as the First Gulf War. The United States unleashed a fury upon Iraq that the world was unprepared for. General Norman Schwarzkopf was the primary Allied commander. He led the tight integration of sea, air, and land assets and carefully and overwhelmingly applied them to specific points, with the result that the Iraqi army was utterly destroyed. There was nothing that could match it. This is General Norman Schwarzkopf. He only ever received a four-star generalship, and quite honestly, I think he probably deserved the fifth star, but that's been a rare thing within the United States military history. But he was one of the most creative, one of the most competent battlefield commanders in quite some time. He and his men devised, really, as we're going to see, it was just a masterpiece of planning, of logistics and fighting. In many ways, it was the ultimate expression of blitzkrieg, lightning war. So it moved quickly and it moved in an integrated manner. What I mean by this is that air power from the sea, from aircraft carriers, would hit in order to free up tanks, which were supported by infantry, which were supported by artillery, the Air Force was bombing. Everything was working in coordination, almost seamlessly. And the Iraqis were just not able to deal with the massive, overwhelming, not only technology, but firepower and competence of the United States military. And there is so much emphasis placed on the technology. It's important not to overlook American troops and American forces were the best trained, most capable troops on the planet. They were as good as it gets. The battles, the tank battles, the air battles were all just so one-sided, not because of luck, but because of careful planning, because of training, and because of the right weapons in the hands of the right people. The Iraqi army fled. The fifth or sixth largest army in the world ran. And the path that they ran on became known as the Highway of Death because the United States Air Force found it as easy targets. The United States won a total victory. So I'd point out this is part of the highway of death, just a small part. And certainly there are some cars and trucks here, but this is a tank. This is an armored personnel carrier. These are personnel carriers. These are personnel carriers. This was heavy armor. This was the heart of the Iraqi army, and it was being utterly destroyed by air, by land, by sea. There was really nothing left. The American military victory was overwhelming. This is the United States Air Force. Now, as the Iraqis fled from Kuwait, they intentionally lit everything on fire, including the oil wells. It took quite some time to put everything out. It was an ecological disaster. But these are a combination of F-15s and F-16s that are flying over it. The United States essentially owned the air very quickly. They possessed it. It was also the first use of the F-117 stealth bomber. Often called a fighter, but was actually a small tactical bomber, the Nighthawk. And it was tremendously effective, and it was more of a revelation to the entire world that the United States was fighting at an entirely different level. Incidentally, the Gulf War had major ramifications for many other nations. China had devised its military doctrine upon the belief that just its overwhelming numbers would be sufficient to act as a counterweight to the United States' technical superiority. But Iraq was embarrassed. Iraq was crushed. And so ever since the Gulf War, China had to rethink its military strategy, realizing that having an army of 7 to 8 million men is no good when the United States can easily kill 7 to 8 million men. And that became a major problem. The success of the Gulf War brought renewed prestige for the United States at home and abroad. It was important to see the United States military act as people expected to act and to accomplish its job. It also was a strong, renewed sense of patriotism at home. By the mid-1990s, President George Bush did not win a second election. Unfortunately, he made a promise of no new taxes, and he wasn't able to fulfill that. And a much lesser man, Bill Clinton, was elected president. So President Bill Clinton was in office during the mid-1990s, which saw a rapid expansion of the American economy due to new technology and due to some very pointed forms of deregulation. What I mean by that is the American government eased back on restrictions that have been in place all the way since the 1910s and 1920s. And that freed up capital. Capital went into investment. Investment created new opportunity. New opportunity created new jobs. More wealth was created. Unfortunately, it was also the era of public debasement of the office of president. President Clinton, when he was elected, was known as a man who was very unfaithful to his wife and willing to lie frequently and continually. And he did not stop that when he became president. And the list of scandals during the Clinton administration is shocking. A lot of people try to act as if Richard Nixon, because Richard Nixon would have been impeached for his role in the Watergate scandal, but Watergate wouldn't even been maybe top 5 within the Clinton administration. There was an impeachment attempt. There was an impeachment of President Bill Clinton, but he was acquitted, and we experience the results of that even today. There was a propriety and sobriety and a prestige to the office of president many years ago, and there is not now. And I think a lot of it can be pointed to the 1990s. In the early 2000s, events were shaped by September 11th, 2001. A man named Osama bin Laden and led his group called Al-Qaeda, who had once been, by the way, American allies back during the Soviet Afghanistan invasion. Well, Al-Qaeda hijacked a number of airplanes, crashed them in the World Trade Center, into the Pentagon, and also into a field in Pennsylvania. Thousands died because of this action. Under President George W. Bush, this was the son of the older President Bush, but under President George W. Bush, the United States launched what was called the War on Terror, which is an unfortunately named event because you cannot conduct a war on an idea. You can do a war against Germany, you can do against a war against Russia, but a war against terror is like a war against poverty. It really doesn't exist. But that didn't stop the United States from usurping massive amounts of money, of capital and personal freedoms, all in the name of safety. America has always had a delicate balance, and it used to be, let me explain. America has always had to maintain a delicate balance between safety and liberty. And for 2 centuries, the American inclination was toward liberty. When in doubt, choose freedom. Um, since September 11th, we've seen a shift in the American character, and we've seen a continual pursuit of safety. Unfortunately, safety can only be guaranteed by liberty, so things happen. This led to another invasion of Iraq, an invasion of Afghanistan, and numerous other engagements. They were all considered part of the war on terror. The reactions at home led to a profound change in American life. Uh, Things like going to the airport became testaments in unnecessary invasions of privacy. People who are not criminals, have never been criminals, and never will be criminals are treated like criminals, all for the sake of not offending the people who definitely are criminals and can easily be discovered by using legal means at their disposal. The constitutional rights of Americans were lost to protect the supposed constitutional rights of people who are not even citizens. The presidency of George W. Bush was also shaped by the recession of 2007 and 2008. The government intervened on a massive scale, much like what happened with the Great Depression. And like the New Deal, a few successes were offset by many failures. And a great deal of money was wasted, was thrown away on corporations that should have been allowed to fail because they were already in the process of dying. This is where coined the phrase too big to fail. Many of the people most directly responsible within the finance industry were protected from any form of prosecution or even consequences. And there was no lesson learned. The American people bore the brunt of a lot of foolishness and a lot of outright theft. Government intervention and interference became more and more a part of